I hears of this place many times. And when them patrollers brung Aunt Alma's boy Malcolm back from the escaping, they beat him, 'cause he seen Canada. At the first lash, Malcolm made a sound that came whipped across his face in a little chant. Canada to go. Canada to go. Everyone heard him says he cannot go. And Master Tom, beating him, agreed. But it touched my ears in a turn. Go to Canada.
And to Canada they came, seeking freedom from slavery, from oppression, in a promised land. The countless black faces in Canada's history, lost to memory, their long story of endurance, struggle, and survival, older than Canada itself.
The new people, the people who have come here recently, when you hear in talking to them, they seem to think that everything that has been accomplished through them. But they fail to realize that we who have been here have built the bridges that they walk on today.
Over 370 years ago, white sails on the Bay of Fundy. Adventurers from Europe, some catching their first glimpse of the promise of this new world. A supply ship bound for Samuel de Champlain at Port Royal. It carried one crew member whose arrival was to mark a beginning. In the land that was to become Canada, this was the first recorded appearance of a black man. He was the ship's translator from Portugal. His name, Mathieu da Costa.
Uzul no gomanen. Wijidaek wen juwagi.
Champlain had overwintered at his Acadian outpost. Now, with the arrival of the Jonas, there were more goods to trade with the Micmac Indians. Eye-catching baubles, trifles, to buy a welcome to the riches of an entire continent. And Mathieu da Costa was there, right at the start.
In my travels, I have come to learn Micmac, the language of the inhabitants of this land. This achievement has brought to me much value, for now I am translator for the French and Micmac nations. I translate their business intentions, their desires, hopes, and motives. With a great exactness, I do this with pride. I am a free man, though I have seen others.
The first of those others would arrive in New France in less than 30 years. The first black slave in Canada. But the history of the black people in this country began on this day in 1606. It was 13 years before any African slaves landed in Virginia, and 2 years before the founding of Quebec. New France watched New England prospering with slaves and followed suit. The Indians enslaved rival tribes and sold some as slave labor for the colonists. The Panis, for construction drudgery, new buildings and roads. But by 1700, although rural New France did most of its own work, there was a new fashion in the towns. In Montreal, the elegance of African slaves in colorful livery. Most worked as domestics, and were treated well for slaves.
In nomine Patri, et Filii, et Spiritus Sanctis.
In the zeal to swell the ranks of the Catholic Church, some slaves were even baptized. What if they actually dared to believe that in the eyes of God, all were equal?
You say that by baptism I shall be like you. I am black, and you are white. I must have my skin taken off then, in order to be like you. They talk about me, not to me, as though I were a fool. There is this difference. I'm indeed a slave.
By now, the number of slaves grew larger every year, especially in Montreal. One of them, Marie-Joseph Angelique, feared she would be sold and separated from her French lover. So she set fire to her mistress's house and fled with her lover towards New England. But the flames spread, almost 50 buildings destroyed. Angelique's color made her all too easy to capture and bring to trial. The verdict?
Coupable.
The sentence? Inhumane. It was the most spectacular crime ever committed by a slave in Canada. And for anyone, arson on this scale carried a harsh penalty. Angelique's punishment was to be a lesson for all slaves.
What more do they want? No matter what I confess, they will cut off my hands and pin them to the church gate. They will cut me to the street, chain me to a post and burn my body. They lied. They are the savages.
Angelique appealed. And in June 1734, a revised sentence was carried out. No further beatings or burnings this time. They simply put her to death. "25 years later, France lost her hold on the St. Lawrence. British troops stormed Quebec. New France fell to Britain. But neither the victor nor the vanquished wanted to see the end of slavery. So the Treaty of Paris kept it going. The French had had 1,000 slaves. The British wanted more. Even the new governor, General Murray. He wrote a New York friend in 1763.
Canadians will work for nobody but themselves. Black slaves are certainly the only people to be depended upon. Pray, therefore, if possible, procure for me 2 stout young fellows who have been accustomed to country business. You may buy for each a clean young wife who may do the female offices about a farm. I shall begrudge no price. I most earnestly entreat your assistance.
Was this to be the only fate of black people in Canada? No wonder they tried to escape. But in the mid-18th century, where to run? To the Indians, with their own uses for slaves? To a harsh wilderness few could survive? Then suddenly, a blow was struck for freedom by 13 American colonies. The War of Independence. Both sides counted heavily on the 500,000 blacks in the colonies. The first rebel killed was black, Crispus Attucks. The British promised freedom and equality to blacks, to lure their opponents' slaves over to their side. And eventually, 100,000 answered the call. The rebel colonies lost a fifth of their slave population. Lord Dunmore, British governor of Virginia, he went into battle with a black regiment. Their motto, liberty to slaves. Dunmore's Ethiopians, they were called, and they fought bravely. But along with the rest of the king's men, they lost the war. What would happen now to liberty for slaves? The British kept their promise, to a point. Among the Loyalists relocated north of the border, 1 out of every 10 was black. The home of many, the future provinces Nova Scotia and New Brunswick. They came with their prized possessions, including their slaves, 1,500 of them. But as well, there were free black loyalists, 3,500, eager to begin a new life in what was truly a promised land. And the promise? Ample farmland and provisions. And that's what white families got. But for 2/3 of the black families, no land at all. For the rest, a few acres each, a way off. The poorest land there was. Most of the free blacks were forced into tenant farming or day labor at a quarter of the white wage. With a shortage of workers, cheap labor was welcome in the building of this new land.
It's not your brother or your sister, and it's me, oh Lord.
Standing in the need of prayer. It's me, oh Lord. Standing in the need of prayer.
There was tolerance for the black communities when demand for labor was high, but violence too when higher-priced whites couldn't find jobs.
Standing in the need of prayer. Oh, Spirit of my faith, bless our coming here. I made friends between the two communities, black and white. Come together, Lord. And for a while, we were a beautiful garden.
Amen.
When I think on it, so many that offered themselves in sin, I felt no fear in asking them to promise themselves to God.
Amen.
Amen. And they thirst for the preaching every evening.
King's soldiers fresh from the war come, couldn't find no jobs, blamed our whole community. They went mad. Nobody stood up against them. They come and tore down our homes.
I needed a black God that night, one I could talk with in confidence. I looked through the window and I saw them drinking in our meeting house. Help us to endure, O Lord. We got a meeting house to build.
Amen.
Generations of slavery had planted the idea of black inferiority in white minds and planted it deeply. So sad tales continued, if only thoughts could be heard.
My missy was nice to me till she caught me dreaming one day. She soft-voiced herself right into my gazings, asked of me, What you mooing in the fields about, Najine? Before I knew who she be, I blurted right out. Canada! She slapped me so hard. I come to wreck. I stood dizzy with no movement. But the blow turned me around inside myself. And my apron come undone, and the straps fall to my sides and tickle my arms. She never forgot till the war comed. We're gonna be loyalists, she says, and you're gonna see what you've been dreaming about behind my back. So, they removed me here with the things and some furniture. Before we left on the ship, I had a baby, and I claimed it's free. But Mrs. Brother was no loyalist. He spit in her face for leaving. Snatched my baby. Said it'd be his, and it'd be staying. I got Celeste here.
Denied the vote, landless or with only the most meager holdings, surviving on courage and determination. They had hardly any support from outside their own communities. And then at last, the seeds of hope were planted.
There can be only one future for our people, and it lies far away in Africa.
The community leaders, black preachers and teachers, sent a delegate to London to petition the British government for help. And they got it. The Reverend Boston King was one of the leaders to help organize the result. A group of whites in London had founded a new African settlement, Sierra Leone, a home for ex-slaves. Now they were short of settlers and invited these free loyalists to prepare for a long voyage back to the distant continent of their ancestors. On January 15th, 1792, almost 1,200 loyalists sailed from Halifax. For some, the founding of a new nation. For others, disease and death. And what of the thousands who were left behind? For the free black families, it would mean an even harder time. Most of their community leaders had sailed for Africa. And throughout British North America at the end of the 18th century, there were still slaves, still running, and still with no place to go.
Oh, keep my soul and deliver me.
But where?
The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He maketh me to lie down in green pastures. He leadeth me beside the still waters. Surely goodness and mercy shall follow me all the days of my life, and I will dwell in the house of the Lord forever.
But where this side of eternity could a black man find release?
No Negro or other person who shall come or be brought into this province shall be subject to the condition of slavery.
John Graves Simcoe, Lieutenant Governor of Upper Canada. What would one day be Ontario became the first British territory to legislate against slavery. The bill was passed, but not without a fight.
greatest resistance. Many plausible arguments of the dearness of labor and the difficulty of obtaining servants were brought forward.
Upper Canadians could keep the 500 blacks they already owned, but at least no new slaves could be brought in. It had all come about because of Chloe Cooley. Her unscrupulous master in Upper Canada had had her abducted and taken south to be sold into the even greater horrors of American slavery.
Get up, you bitch! Get up!
In spite of the province's attitudes to slave labor, this had been an affront to British justice. The public outcry at the fate of Chloe Cooley ended with Simcoe's anti-slavery bill. And by 1834, when the whole British Empire abolished slavery for good, Canada became a haven for runaways. The word spread south, filtering light into the dark despair in America, into the slave states with their unspeakable cruelties to blacks. Beaten into submission, deliberately kept in ignorance, forbidden to marry without consent, their families broken by whim or for profit. Where did they find the spirit to escape to the north? And yet all through the first decades of the 19th century, thousands fleeing up the secret trails where help could be found, through the sympathetic stations on the Underground Railroad, in a stealthy nighttime traffic.
Mind you doesn't tramp out the sound of leaves, nor let the mud suck escape from your ankles and bear your presence to the captor. Be the image of your Lord. A thief in the night come to collect your soul. Spirit yourself to the tip of the drinking gourd, north to Canada. And when the mother of the heavens, that morning star smiles on you, rising to the east, that's a warning. Seek out a hiding place. Dark and thorny is the path where the pilgrim makes his way, but beyond this veil of sorrow lie the fields of endless day.
By 1850, 10,000. By 1860, 40,000. And still they came, rejoicing.
Lordy, Lord! 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 Please accept my singing, my shouting, and my jumping as praise in the heights. 'Cause it's you what done brought me over. Let my shout noise be caught on the wind, blowing back down the sea to my brothers and sisters left behind, to tell them of this freedom. Canada. Canada, Lord. What must that word mean?
The fields of endless day. The promised land, new lives to build, and old dreams to make real. For some, the new freedom brought only endless days of laboring for a pittance. But for many, it meant their own communities, new names on the map: Wilberforce, Dawn, Buxton. In the fertile farmlands of southwestern Ontario, here weathered monuments to their achievement and to those who helped them. One was a white Southerner, the Reverend William King. He had freed his 15 slaves and brought them here to Buxton. He set up a company, organized the purchase of 9,000 acres near Chatham in 1849, and brought in hundreds of black families from south of the border.
Here are men who were bred in slavery, who purchased land, built their own homes, bought their own implements, and have supported themselves. Years ago, most of them were slaves who owned nothing, not even their children. Now they own themselves, they own their houses and farms, and they have their wives and children about them. They are enfranchised citizens of a government which protects their rights.
Someone would have to protect black rights in Buxton. Because even before these people came here, when Reverend King was still looking for land, there was a move to keep them out.
The Negro is a distinct species. Keep them out. Amalgamation is as disgusting to the eye as it is immoral.
The ideas of a local politician, Edwin Larwell.
With what a feeling of horror would the people look upon the introducing of several hundreds of Africans into the very heart of their neighborhood. Keep Canada white. Yeah.
Public protests, petitions, but all in vain. Larwell lost. He got enough support to be elected to the legislature, but the government ignored him. And soon Buxton's blacks were sending the good news south to friends and family.
Come to the land of liberty and freedom, where the colored man is not despised, nor a deaf ear turned to him. This is a place to live in peace and enjoy the comforts of life.
Farmers, tradesmen, craftsmen, but still.
They're regarded as an inferior caste. As a consequence, the colored people are found mostly in isolated communities.
Some fought isolation. Chatham's provincial freemen criticized white philanthropists for setting up communities like Buxton that kept blacks and whites apart. The paper's founder, Mary Ann Shadd, the first woman editor in the whole of North America. She'd come to Chatham from Philadelphia. To her, unless the blacks refused charity and learned to help themselves, they'd never be Canadians.
You know, colored folk here in Chatham, Windsor, and Buxton, they think of living here in exile. Home is here. The easy way out is the coward's way out. Strength and pride and independence. Be a truly free man, Reuben. You just burn that in your heart. Never you forget it.
It was the coming generation that carried their hopes, the children who would never know slavery. Their parents had yearned too long for the simple privilege of going to school. So the Buxton blacks built a school for their children, and the Reverend King agreed.
It is our duty as Christians to educate them not only for time, but for eternity.
The slaves had always known they wouldn't ever be free until they broke the bonds of illiteracy. Now they made real the old dream of being able to read and write.
This settlement is a perfect success. There is no doubt about that.
But then, away to the south, the rumble of war.
Though many miles away, I fancied I heard the cannon say, "The year of Jubilee has come. Return, you exiles, home.
And from Buxton alone, 700 returned to the Civil War. At last, a chance to fight against slavery. It was a long and costly battle.
White faces sank into the grave. Black faces too, and all were brave. Their red blood chilled Columbia's heart. She could not tell the two apart.
And over the blood-stained fields rose the voice of Abraham Lincoln, proclaiming emancipation. Slavery no more. Now the exiles in Canada could go home, to places and people they loved, especially the new arrivals, back to the optimism down south. Some remained to keep the settlements going. But after a time, even many of these drifted away to jobs on railroad gangs, or to leave rural Ontario and try to find work in the cities. But always their faith went with them.
And it shall come to pass that the Lord shall give thee rest from thy sorrow and from thy fear and from the hard bondage wherein thou wast made to serve.
Their Buxton church still stands. Now it has a white congregation. But just down the road, the prosperous farms of hundreds of the descendants of the black settlers.
And my people shall dwell in a peaceable habitation and in quiet resting places.
The fields of endless day for pioneers who helped write Canadian history. Forgotten names among the builders of a nation. There have been such names right across the country. Out on the Pacific coast, a decade after Buxton began, British Columbia was practically empty. To the south, before the Civil War, there were the free western states, without slavery, but with an uncertain future for blacks. One California group visited Victoria looking for a safe place to settle, and that is just what they found. 400 families emigrated here in 1858. At the invitation of the colony's governor, James Douglas, one of his plans to build up the population. Those who came were free, educated, and prosperous. Some entered local politics. And in 1860, this was the only defense force Victoria had, the Pioneer Rifles. Every man was black. It didn't take long for the inevitable conflict to come. Not war, racism. Black families were forced to go farther afield, up into the Cariboo and out among the islands. Willis Stark was part of a family on Salt Spring Island. His parents were among the first settlers there, and his descendants are still in British Columbia and still tell stories of the family's arrival. Lewis and Sylvia Stark came here in 1860 to pioneer on Salt Spring Island. Mrs. Stark lived until 1944, to the age of 106. For years, she'd told her children of the thrill and the dread of that Pacific wilderness.
It was a bright day when we came to the northwest side of the island in a sailing vessel. The cattle were lowered into the water with strong ropes, where they swam to land and took the trail to their new home, lowing as they went. The first sight of our new home was an unfinished log cabin surrounded by trees and thick underbrush. It was anything but encouraging. It was so lonely in those days. We worked hard, enduring great hardship. But I had one happy thought in this wilderness. It was our own, and it stood for our freedom.
Another pioneer and an almost legendary figure on the prairies, John Ware. He rode up across the border on September the 25th, 1882, an ex-slave turned cowboy, said to be the first ever to bring Texas longhorns into what would become Alberta. His daughter, Nettie, in her 80s, recalls.
Oh, he could handle cattle in a quick manner, too, and he understood cattle. That's all my father ever did. My mother was more of a carpenter than my father was. If there was a door to be hung in that, mother could hang the door. Father, he was no good. He couldn't drive a nail straight, but he knew cattle. My mother was taken as a bride to Millerville.
That was on the 29th of February, 1892.
She came home when I was going to be born, but the rest of the children were all born at Millerville, and no doctor. My sister, she had a twin brother. No doctors. He would break horses. They put them into a corral and gradually edge a saddle onto them. But sometimes the horse just wouldn't take to this saddle business. But Father, he was a big man, and it took a big horse to buck him off. But not very often that happened.
But once too often. On September the 12th, 1905, less than 2 weeks after Alberta became a province, John Ware's horse put a foot in a badger hole and crashed to the ground, her rider pinned underneath. And before anyone could realize, John Ware was gone from all but memory. All this time, the prairies had been filling up, part of the government's immigration push. They flooded in from all over Europe and the States. There were black families and even black communities. But in 1911, Alberta received one group of American homesteaders who would cause government policy to change.
Free entrance for the black men. But if many more come here to homestead, some action will be taken.
Government action without precedent in Canada. It centered on the Oklahoma Creek Negroes, blacks with some Indian blood in their families. Ottawa soon heard from one of its immigration inspectors.
The mixed race has raised the lower and more harmless instincts of the Negro, but only to a more brutal level. And with the combination, he thus becomes a most undesirable person.
For the first time in Canada, racism gave birth to an official national policy.
Keep the Negro across the line.
A memo reached Washington from Ottawa.
The American Negro may be barred on the ground that he could not become adapted to the rigorous northern climate, and consequently might become a public charge.
Among the petitions, one from the IODE, the Imperial Order of Daughters of the Empire, with their own slant on the situation.
We protest the introduction into our communities of the well-known appetites of the black man. No white woman would be safe. We all agree we wouldn't have a single moment's peace.
And so a door closed in the West. Meanwhile, in the cities to the east, an urban boom. Toronto at the turn of the century. when mechanization was driving people off the farms and into the city. Black people, too, most of them tucked away out of sight, in the slums. But there was one, a livery boy, who grew up to prosper in real estate, William Hubbard. Toronto alderman in 1894, later controller, and even acting mayor of the city. A rare success story. For most blacks, the only work going was low on every scale. Unskilled labor, building roads and railways, service jobs, cleaning up after others. Stereotyped on the labor market and everywhere. The blackface image, happy, silly, amusing. An idea of the race that had little to do with reality. But in 1914, reality hit the world with a bang. Canada saw it as a white man's war. Ottawa's chief of staff was Major General G.W. Gwatkin.
The civilized Negro is vain and imitative. In the trenches, he is not likely to make a good fighter, and the average white man will not associate with him on terms of equality.
Eventually, when blacks were recruited, they were usually kept together, mostly in work battalions, thanks to the protests of white officers.
I have been fortunate to have secured a very fine class of recruits, and did not think it fair to these men that they should have to mingle with Negroes.
Military leaders had overlooked someone, the third Canadian ever to win the Victoria Cross. A black from Nova Scotia, William Hall. He'd fought in the Crimean War. He'd been decorated for his valor at the battles of Sebastopol and Inkerman. And he'd fought at the relief of Lucknow during the Indian Mutiny. Lucknow on November 16, 1857. An ancient mosque held by Indian mutineers had been the key to the besieged town. William Hall had manned one of the cannons there. Under a hail of musketry and grenades, he had pumped shell after shell into the building until it was taken. It won him the Victoria Cross. Yet who in Canada had heard of this 19th century hero, or seen the monument his province had raised to his memory? Certainly not the military leaders in World War I. One of the Canadian blacks who went off to war in 1914 was Deacon Sidney Jones of Halifax.
When the war broke out, I enlisted in the 106th Battalion. Well, you know, it's kind of dim what happened back there. I don't know that I can pick out anything much, except that there was one incident there, and I remember that I don't imagine I'll ever forget, and that was a little something that happened between a lieutenant and I, a young lieutenant, who one day told me in a very ungentlemanly manner that it was a white man's war, and he didn't see why that there was any blacks into it, and that didn't sit very well with me, being the age that I was, and he being probably not more than a year or so older. But there wasn't anything I could do about it with him, because he was in authority. He was an officer, and I was just a buck private. So I had to take that. I still remember it. I don't like it, though.
Then armistice and home.
It started to change after the First World War, because not only black people, but the white people too, they worked together as groups. They took the same order, they ate the same food, they slept together in the same barracks and so forth. They developed an entirely new idea of living together and being Canadian. Yes. People were people.
One thing hadn't changed, not since the 19th century, and that was the identification of the working black with railways. In Montreal, as late as 1941, half the men in the black community were porters. It would be a great day when the breakthrough finally came into other jobs. But in the 1920s, when Harry Gary came from Jamaica to Ontario,
the only job that I could get at the time was a railroad job, a cook, or a dishwasher. I wasn't a cook at the time. A dishwasher, and run between Montreal and Toronto, clean up the kitchen, wash the dishes, and do a little chore around the car. It was very hard to get a job. Not like it now. And we weren't organized. You work until. It was no 8 hours a day. You just work until.
Don't care how much where your education was concerned. You couldn't get anything other than service work. Even if the employer wanted was to employ you, the employees wouldn't want to have anything as long as you were a black person.
Men and women both were pretty tight, so some perhaps they didn't think about education and things like that as much as they could have. Tired people don't seem to be able to do those things. So therefore, they thought that the children would probably grow up to do the same things that they did.
Accomplish your plan. Is your heart heavy laden? Do you fear the Lord's command? Do you feel that no one loves you?
So all through the church was a very important thing. In fact, it was the most important thing for us black people, because there wasn't much else for us to be proud of or belong to, except the family and the church.
it had been that way since black people first came to Canada. It was like that in Montreal of the 1920s, when a black community flourished. A change had begun with a Jamaican named Marcus Garvey. He'd gone to the States in 1916 and began to visit Canada in 1928. He'd formed the UNIA, the Universal Negro Improvement Association, and was encouraging blacks everywhere to take pride in their race, in their origins, and to work even harder for a better future. And suddenly, black society in Canada took on a new life. Someone who remembers Garvey, Mrs. Anne Packwood in Montreal.
Listening to him, you just became inspired. And you thought to yourself, well, here is the man we've been waiting for. This is a Moses who's come to lead his people through the wilderness. And you sat with rapt attention and listened to every word.
So did Mrs. Violet Blackman in Toronto.
Because he was a man that never teaches hatred. With all that had been done, he was a man of love.
He came at a very necessary period, I would say, because the Negro was drifting, And he needed a sense of direction.
There were a lot of our people at the time were more concerned about where they were born instead of the race.
The Negro, on the whole, was very much ashamed of his background. He was ashamed of the fact many times that he was black.
Marcus Garvey had a cure for that.
Take the kinks out of your brain, not out of your hair. Try to be the best black man, not the worst white man.
Well, after you talked to him, you felt so differently about those things. You just felt that it was a process that you had gone through and cast aside, and that you learned how to be very proud of your blackness. You know, they had the Red Cross throughout Canada and the United States, etc. Well, he organized a group to do the same work, but instead of the Red Cross on their little caps, they had a black cross.
Just one of the social and service groups that sprang up all over North America. Garvey's showmanship was working. There was a black anthem and a flag.
The red, the black, and the green. The red was the blood that was shed. The black was your race, and the green was the green fields of Africa.
And you know, it did something to you. When you stepped out there, you felt very proud of yourself. You felt proud of your black skin. You marched to the drum that had a different beat. That's just it.
Ethiopia, the land of our fathers, the land where the gods love to be. As storm clouds at night sudden gathers, our armies come rushing to thee.
Black Canadians on the march, and no longer on the run. But centuries of slavery had left their mark. For some, the spirit to endure. But for white society, attitudes of distance, neglect, forcing these Canadians for far too long to seek from within what they were denied outside their own communities. Encouragement, equality, pride, progress.
I think sometimes we grow too narrow in our desires. And we don't need to grow narrower, we need to grow broader. And Langston Hughes sums it up so beautifully in this poem here that I think it should be the password. It's called My People. The night is beautiful. So are the faces of my people. The stars are beautiful. So are the eyes of my people. Beautiful also is the sun. Beautiful also are the souls of my people. The people who have come here recently, when you hear in talking to them, they seem to think that everything that has been accomplished through them. But they fail to realize that we who have been here have built the bridges that they walk on today. And I think when that is thoroughly understood, that there'll be not only more unity and understanding, but more progress.